The sterile hum of the hospital hallway couldn't mask the storm brewing behind the glass doors of the maternity ward. A storm born not of blood or biology, but of prejudice, fear, and a deeply human crisis. Dr. Patricia Moore had seen nearly everything in her 25 years of delivering life into the world. But nothing prepared her for the moment she watched a young couple, Chris and Marta Bennett, turn their backs on the four beautiful, fragile newborns they had waited years to meet. These were the babies Marta had carried for 9 long months. The dream of motherhood finally realized after endless fertility treatments and sleepless nights filled with hope. And yet, the second those tiny, perfect children entered the world with skin tones that didn't match their parents' expectations, everything shattered. The Bennetts had chosen white donors to reflect their own image, blonde, blue-eyed, suburbia personified. But due to an unthinkable error at the fertility clinic, the embryos that developed into the quadruplets had come from a different genetic source. When Chris saw them, dark-skinned, curly-haired, undeniably black, he didn't see children. He saw a mistake. And in that moment, his love, his longing, his promise to raise them vanished into cold fury and legal threats. Dr. Moore saw it happen in real time. The way Marta's color drained, her hands trembled as she hovered over the photographs of her own children, too scared to speak against her husband's wrath. Chris's rejection was swift, calculated, merciless. "They're not ours," he said. They're not what we expected, or we're struggling to understand. No, to him, they were simply not his. It was as if their humanity disappeared the moment their skin tone diverged from what he'd imagined. And Marta, heartbroken, disoriented, conflicted, followed him. Not because she didn't feel the pull of something maternal in her chest, but because she didn't yet know how to disobey the man she had married. A man who made love conditional, family disposable, and children replaceable. Dr. Moore wanted to scream. She wanted to grab them by the shoulders and remind them that these babies were innocent, that love was more than genes or appearances. That parenthood wasn't about optics. It was about sacrifice, about rising to the occasion even when the script went wrong. But instead, she stood silently in her office as the couple walked out. Marta didn't even see the babies. Chris made sure of that. And in the wake of their departure, 4 tiny infants were left behind, unwanted, unnamed, unloved by the people who had once called them miracles. In the quiet aftermath, it wasn't just the nurse Elizabeth who wept as she stood watch over the cribs that night. Dr. Moore went home carrying a weight that medicine couldn't treat. She couldn't stop thinking about those babies, how it wasn't just a failure of science or process, but a failure of humanity. And then, like a spark in the dark, a thought flickered. Her sister, Monica, a black woman in her 40s. A woman who had spent years battling systemic bias in adoption agencies that saw her skin color and age as disqualifiers. A woman with love overflowing and no one to give it to. What if fate had intervened? What if this heartbreak was also an opportunity for healing, for redemption, not just for the children, but for everyone touched by their existence? Dr. Moore made a call that would ripple across generations. She didn't just save those babies from the cold machinery of foster care. She set into motion a story of love that would grow stronger than blood. And she did it quietly, humbly, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. What happened in that hospital wasn't just a mix-up. It was a crucible, a test of character that exposed the rot beneath appearances and the resilience hidden within unexpected places. Chris failed it. Marta hesitated. But Dr. Moore, in her simple courage, passed. And through her, Monica and Derek would soon welcome 4 children into their home who were once discarded like errors, but who would become miracles not because of how they were born, but because of how they were loved. When Monica and Derek first laid eyes on the 4 newborns lying in identical hospital cribs, something unspoken yet powerful stirred in their hearts, a sense of destiny, a call to love that defied biology, legality, or societal expectation. The journey that brought them here had been paved with closed doors and quiet heartbreaks. They had tried for years to adopt, often met with rejection veiled in euphemisms like, not a demographic fit. But when Monica's sister, Dr. Patricia Moore, called her that night, her voice trembling as she described the abandoned quadruplets, something shifted. This wasn't just about the aching absence in their home or their longing to become parents. This was about four children who had just entered the world only to be denied by those who were supposed to love them first. In that moment, Monica didn't hesitate. She pressed her hand against the glass separating her from the nursery and whispered, "They're perfect." Adopting four infants at once would terrify most people, especially a middle-aged black couple in a system not designed to favor them. But Monica and Derek weren't most people. He was a calm and steady high school math teacher, the kind of man who saw patterns and solutions where others saw chaos. She was the heartbeat of their community, running a local bakery filled with warmth and the scent of cinnamon rolls. They had love to give, and when faced with the possibility of keeping the quadruplets together, there was no turning back. They understood the power of unity. They had lived it in their own marriage, in their community, in the ways they showed up for others. And now they would live it for four tiny lives who deserved to grow up not as strangers scattered by the foster system, but as siblings bound by something deeper than DNA. The adoption process was a whirlwind of paperwork, home visits, and legal logistics. But through it all, Monica and Derek never lost sight of the children at the center of it. They named them Alan, Zara, Isaiah, and Diane, each name chosen with care and symbolic meaning: strength, brilliance, salvation, and faith. Those names weren't just aspirational. They were declarations. These children would be loved, not just by two people, but by an entire village that rose up in support. The neighborhood rallied around them with donated cribs, strollers, baby clothes, and enough diapers to supply an army. The church organized a meal train that didn't slow for months. Grandmothers who weren't biologically related became honorary aunties, and even strangers dropped off gifts, touched by the story of four babies abandoned, but not forgotten. Still, the nights were long and the cries often came in harmony, four wails echoing off the walls in a house too small for the size of the love it held. Derek took on tutoring gigs after school, and Monica ran the bakery with one hand on a mixing bowl and the other cradling a baby monitor. They were exhausted, stretched thin, sometimes doubting whether love alone was enough. But then there would be a moment: Isaiah's hand reaching for his sisters in sleep, Zara's first giggle, Alan's determined crawl toward his father's shoes, Diane's quiet humming in the crib, and it reminded them why they had said yes. These weren't just babies. They were miracles. As the years passed, those early struggles transformed into rituals. Monica hand-stitched costumes for Halloween, each child insisting on a different theme. Derek taught them to ride bikes, jogging behind with outstretched arms. Family dinners were loud, chaotic, and sacred. They raised their children to know their worth, their brilliance, and above all, their bond. The kids were different in every way that mattered: personalities, talents, interests. But they were united by the unshakable sense that they belonged. And that belonging was cultivated by two people who made the decision to show up every single day. What made Monica and Derek extraordinary wasn't just their capacity to love, but their refusal to let the world define what family should look like. They never pretended the children's origins didn't matter. From an early age, they answered the hard questions with gentle honesty. Yes, you were adopted. Yes, your birth parents walked away. No, that doesn't mean you weren't wanted. What matters is who stayed. What matters is who showed up when it counted. They didn't ignore the children's racial identity. They celebrated it. Raised in a neighborhood that reflected the vibrant spectrum of Black culture, the Quadruplets saw themselves in their teachers, their pastors, their neighbors. They weren't anomalies or exceptions. They were part of a living, breathing legacy that stretched back generations. Monica often said that motherhood didn't begin in the womb, but in the willingness to love without limits. And Derek believed that fatherhood meant being the safe place, the steady hand, the one who catches you when you fall and pushes you forward when you are ready to soar. Together, they created a home not defined by origin, but by intention. Every choice they made was laced with sacrifice, and every sacrifice was a seed planted in the lives of the four children they called their own. They weren't saints. They had moments of frustration, fear, and fatigue. But what made their story resonate wasn't perfection. It was perseverance. It was the decision to say yes when it would have been easier to say no. It was waking up in the middle of the night for the 10th time and still whispering, "I love you," to a crying child. It was fighting through the trauma of infertility, rejection, and systemic bias, only to give their hearts completely to four babies born from someone else's genes but destined to be theirs in every way that mattered. In the eyes of Monica and Derek, family wasn't about biology. It was about belief. Belief in what could be. Belief in healing. Belief in love. And as Alan, Zara, Isaiah, and Diane grew into bright, compassionate, and curious young adults, their lives bore testimony to that belief. Every achievement, every milestone, every smile was a quiet victory over the idea that love must be genetically inherited. Monica and Derek proved otherwise. They rewrote the definition of parenthood, not with a courtroom ruling or a birth certificate, but with every diaper changed, every story read, every bedtime prayer whispered in the dark. And in doing so, they didn't just give the quadruplets a home, they gave them a legacy. One built not on bloodlines, but on unwavering love. For 10 long years, Marta Bennett lived in the echo of a choice that had fractured her soul. On the outside, she built a life marked by quiet elegance. Her interior design business flourished. Her home was tastefully curated, and her name became respected in affluent circles. But inside, there was an ache that never ceased, a silence that screamed louder with every passing birthday she didn't celebrate, every scraped knee she didn't bandage, and every bedtime story she never read. She had walked away from the hospital that day with a small knitted baby hat clutched in her trembling hands, something she had made in hope and love, now reduced to a symbol of everything she had lost. Chris, her husband at the time, had drawn a line in the sand. It was either the babies or him. And Marta, afraid of standing alone with 4 newborns and even more afraid of standing up to a man who had controlled every part of her life, made the decision she would come to regret every day that followed. Their marriage, unsurprisingly, didn't survive the weight of that decision. Within a year, Chris was gone, remarried, relocated, seemingly unbothered. But Marta remained, and so did the emptiness. Every now and then, she would pull out the wooden box tucked away in the back of her closet. Inside it were her private truths, that tiny baby hat, a faded copy of the original sonogram, and newspaper clippings she had impulsively cut out whenever the miracle quads made local headlines. There they were, smiling on their 5th birthday, blowing out candles on 4 different cakes, each reflecting their own blossoming identity. She traced their faces with trembling fingers, searching for hints of herself, aching for a connection that could never be spoken of. It wasn't just the regret of not raising them, it was the haunting knowledge that she had forfeited the right to be called their mother. In the public's eyes, they were orphans turned miracles, raised by heroes. In Marta's heart, they were still hers, not legally, not even biologically. But spiritually, they were the children of her longing, the dream that had turned to ash the moment she chose fear over love. Meanwhile, in a modest, love-filled home in a vibrant Chicago suburb, the 4 children she left behind were becoming everything she had once dreamed of, and more. Alan, the oldest by a few minutes, emerged as a natural leader with a quiet confidence that lit up every room he entered. Zara channeled her emotions into vibrant canvases, turning the family refrigerator into an evolving art gallery of joy, sorrow, and curiosity. Isaiah, the most introspective of the 4, could often be found nose deep in books far beyond his age, always asking questions about how things worked and why people were the way they were. And Diane, sweet, gentle Diane, carried in her small frame the emotional compass of the family. Whenever tempers flared or hearts hurt, it was Diane who stepped in, offering hugs instead of arguments, listening when words failed. Their adoptive parents, Monica and Derek, weren't rich in the traditional sense, but they were wealthy beyond measure in love, resilience, and determination. Every laugh that echoed through their home, every holiday photo on the mantle, every scraped knee tended to with care, was a quiet triumph against the cruelty of how their story had started. Monica and Derek, a Black couple in their 40s who had faced repeated rejections in the adoption system for reasons too steeped in prejudice to be said aloud, found in these 4 children not just a family, but a calling. Raising quadruplets wasn't easy. It meant sleepless nights, financial sacrifices, and a home that was always loud, always chaotic, always alive. But they met every challenge with grace, grit, and an unwavering sense of purpose. They didn't just give the children food and shelter, they gave them an identity, a history, A love that wasn't bound by DNA but strengthened by every bedtime story read, every lesson taught, and every moment they chose to stay when others might have walked away. The contrast couldn't have been starker. While Marta sat in her elegant living room years later, reading an article about the children's 10th birthday and fighting back tears, Monica and Derek were navigating a new storm. Derek had recently been diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's. The tremors, once barely noticeable, were becoming more frequent. The burden was growing heavier, but never heavier than the love that anchored their family. The children, now old enough to understand the magnitude of what their father was facing, stepped up with the kind of maturity that moved Monica to tears. Alan mowed the lawn without being asked. Zara managed his medication schedule with artistic precision. Isaiah, the researcher, dove into medical articles and simplified them for the rest of the family. Diane, as always, became the emotional glue, refusing to let her dad face his worst days alone. And yet, amidst this new chapter of pain and perseverance, a letter arrived, an unexpected reminder that the past had not fully loosened its grip. The fertility clinic where it had all begun was closing, and with that came news that could alter the trajectory of their lives. When the quadruplets turned 18, they would have the right to access information about their biological origins. And perhaps more jarring still, their biological parents could request contact too. For Monica, the thought was paralyzing. She had always been honest with her children, but this was different. This wasn't just about telling the truth. It was about facing the terrifying possibility that the woman who had once rejected them might want to know them now. Would the kids still see her, Monica, as their real mother? Would their love shift even a little? The questions kept her up at night. What she didn't know was that, miles away, Marta was asking the same questions from a very different place. 10 years after that fateful day in the hospital parking lot, she received the same letter. And with trembling hands, she called her lawyer. When they turn 18, she said, "That's the right time. That's when I'll try." She spent the years that followed trying to become the kind of woman they might one day want to meet. Therapy, a bigger house, a business built with integrity. She couldn't undo the past, but maybe, just maybe, she could prepare for the chance to explain it. What neither woman knew then was that their lives, though on opposite sides of a painful truth, had been quietly braided together through the choices they made in love, fear, and longing. And the moment when those two paths would meet again, one out of guilt, the other out of love, was drawing closer with every heartbeat. As the Norris family gathered around the dinner table that evening, it wasn't just the aroma of home-cooked food that hung in the air. It was tension, curiosity, and the weight of unspoken truths. The once light-hearted conversations about college applications and scholarship offers had quieted. Something lingered behind Diane's hesitant eyes and subdued demeanor. Normally the emotional glue of the family, the one who smoothed tensions and soothed rough edges, Diane now carried a quiet urgency. As Derek, ever the attentive father despite his advancing Parkinson's, gently asked about her status with Northwestern, Diane diverted the question, not with a lie, but with a deeper truth. "There's something I need to talk to all of you about," she began, her voice steady but strained. The room stilled. The unspoken bond between the four siblings was palpable. They had grown up in sync, intuitively sensing each other's emotions, and at that moment, the other three felt it. Something was coming that would change everything. Diane spoke with care, her words measured, as if every sentence could tear at the delicate fabric of their family's reality. She had been researching, she confessed, not because she was unsatisfied or ungrateful, but because something inside her, a curiosity, a yearning, had been growing for years. She had discovered the lawsuit, the one the Bennetts had filed against the fertility clinic nearly 2 decades earlier. The one that revealed the truth. They had been rejected at birth, not because they were unwanted children, but because their skin color didn't match the expectations of the people who had arranged for their birth. It wasn't just a mistake, it was abandonment based on race. Gasps followed. Silence descended like a thick fog. Alan's jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the wooden table. Zara blinked hard, eyes shimmering with tears. Isaiah, always the quiet one, lowered his gaze in deep thought, absorbing every word like a data point in a complex algorithm. And Monica and Derek, these two loving pillars who had raised them, fought for them, loved them unconditionally, looked stunned, exposed. They had always promised honesty. They had always vowed transparency when the time was right. And yet, they hadn't said everything. Derek's voice, gentle and firm, broke the silence. We were going to tell you after your birthday. We wanted to wait until you were all ready to process it. We never wanted to hide anything, just to protect you. But the children, now young adults standing on the threshold of their futures, didn't want protection. They wanted truth. Monica, her eyes brimming with emotion, took her husband's hand. We should have told you sooner, you're right. It wasn't easy to say aloud, but the truth needed air. They explained the fertility clinic mix-up, how Monica's sister, Dr. Patricia Moore, had been the delivering doctor, how she had contacted them immediately after the Bennetts walked away, how the adoption had been expedited, and how the Bennetts, the biological parents by legal standards, had not even wanted the children to stay together. You were supposed to be separated, Monica whispered, her voice trembling. But Patricia refused. She called us. She fought for you. That's how we found you. That's how we became a family. Each word struck like thunder. The children sat in stunned silence, their sense of self shifting in real time. Alan, who had always prided himself on resilience, suddenly felt small. So they didn't want us, he said bitterly. They left us because we were black. Monica leaned forward, voice breaking, but resolute. That's not the whole story. Your birth mother, she wanted to see you. She hesitated. But your birth father, he made the choice. It was Diane who once again brought a sliver of grace into the room. So maybe she didn't walk away willingly, she said softly. Maybe she wanted us. Hope flickered. Could it be? Could the woman who had knit that tiny hat, who had carried them for 9 months, have loved them, even if she couldn't fight for them? Monica nodded. Your Aunt Patricia saw it in her eyes. She saw a woman torn apart, not cold or cruel, just trapped. In the hours that followed, the family sat together unraveling a story they never expected to hear. They pieced together the reality of their beginnings, a tangled mess of love, race, rejection, and unexpected redemption. Diane shared how she had drafted a message on the National Donor Sibling Registry, one she hadn't yet sent. Her longing to understand, to connect, battled against the fear of rejection and her love for the only parent she'd ever known. Alan was furious, not at Diane, but at the history itself. They gave us up because we were the wrong color, he spat. And now they get to come back? But even his anger was laced with heartbreak. Zara wept quietly, while Isaiah, ever the scientist, simply asked, do we know who they are? Do we know where they are? The conversation lasted until midnight. The questions didn't stop. The pain didn't disappear. But through it all, the one constant was love. Derek, through his trembling hands and unwavering calm, reminded them that no matter the DNA, no matter the documents, no matter the origins, they were family. Monica, with every word and tear, made it clear that nothing could take their place in her heart. And the siblings, conflicted, raw, but united, found solace in each other. Later that night, Diane lay awake staring at the ceiling. She hadn't pressed send on the message. She hadn't invited the past into their lives just yet, but she had opened the door. And though they were standing on the edge of a cliff, uncertain of what lay beyond, one thing was clear. They would leap together. Because in the end, their story was more than biology. It was a story of chosen love, of people who had stepped up when others walked away, of a mother and father who had claimed them, not by blood, but by heart, and of siblings born of chance, bound by something stronger. For 18 years, the truth had been tucked away in shadows, spoken of only in fragments, concealed behind protective instincts and softened by love. But no amount of time can contain the pull of identity, of origin. When Diane gathered the courage to bring up what she had discovered, the lawsuit, the fertility clinic's mistake, the rejection by their biological parents, it was as though a dam had cracked open, flooding the Norris family with memories, fear, and questions that had long lingered beneath the surface. The living room, once the nucleus of joy and warmth, became a courtroom of silent stares, held breaths, and unspoken sorrow. Alan, always the strong and grounded one, clenched his fist as his heart tried to make sense of the betrayal. How someone could look at a newborn, their own child, and walk away. Zara, the sensitive artist, felt tears burning her eyes, not just from sadness, but from the old ache of never quite knowing where her creativity came from. Isaiah, the quiet observer, looked between faces, processing not just facts, but their implications. And Diane, the gentle soul, the peacemaker, sat with her heart exposed, asking the questions everyone else was too afraid to voice. Their parents, Monica and Derek, who had raised them with endless devotion, could feel the emotional shift rippling through their children. Monica's voice trembled as she admitted that she had known more than she had told them. Her sister, Dr. Patricia Moore, the woman who had delivered them, had witnessed their birth and the immediate withdrawal of the Bennetts. Monica's hands trembled not because of guilt, but because of the fear that honesty might now loosen the very bonds she had worked so hard to build. "You were wanted," Derek said firmly, his voice cutting through the room like a beam of light. "From the moment we saw you, you were everything." But as the truth came out that their biological parents, Chris and Marta Bennett, had rejected them because of their skin color, the room felt colder. It wasn't just a mistake. It was rejection based on race, a deep and personal wound that no child, even one so loved, should ever have to carry. And yet, amid the pain, there was something else rising too, a sense of clarity, of identity. They weren't defined by the people who had walked away, but by those who had stayed. Monica and Derek had been there through sleepless nights, scraped knees, and growing pains. They were the ones who clapped at every recital, cheered at every track meet, and stayed up late to help with science fair boards and college essays. Still, the quadruplets weren't immune to the pull of knowing. They wanted to understand why someone could turn their back on life they had helped create. Diane, ever the bridge between hearts, wondered aloud if maybe Marta had felt differently than Chris, that maybe her silence wasn't agreement, but powerlessness. And Monica, despite the pain in her chest, nodded slowly. "Maybe she did," she whispered. The conversation stretched deep into the night, not as a confrontation, but as a revelation. For the first time, all the pieces were being laid on the table, not just the joyful ones, but the sharp, jagged truths too. The truth about their beginning didn't erase the love they had been raised in, but it gave it more meaning. Because this wasn't just a story of chosen family, it was a story of 4 children whose very existence had been seen as inconvenient, and who had grown into resilient, brilliant young adults because someone else chose to fight for them. The Bennetts may have turned away, but Monica and Derek had stepped in, and Dr. Patricia Moore had defied an unjust system to make sure those 4 babies stayed together. That night, as the house finally fell quiet, the air was thick with exhaustion and unspoken emotion. Each sibling retreated to their rooms, trying to make sense of the new pieces added to their life story. Alan sat at his desk, staring at an old photo of them as toddlers in the backyard, mud on their faces, joy in their eyes. Zara sketched furiously, turning grief into color and form. Isaiah, ever the researcher, opened his laptop and began digging into the fertility clinic's history, needing to understand the full scope of what had happened. And Diane, sitting cross-legged on her bed, opened the registry website again. Her finger hovered over the submit button, not with hope or anger, but with a desire for wholeness. Maybe it wasn't about forgiveness. Maybe it was about understanding, about healing. In another room, Monica cried silently in Derek's arms. "What if they look at us differently now?" she whispered. "What if knowing where they came from makes them question where they belong?" Derek kissed her forehead, the way he always had when she was overwhelmed. "They know who raised them," he said softly. "They know who never left." It wasn't just reassurance. It was truth, the kind that grows stronger under the weight of time, challenge, and unconditional love. The next morning, everything felt the same and yet entirely changed. Breakfast was quieter, conversations more measured, but there was also something new, a raw honesty that hadn't existed before. They were no longer just a family built on love. They were a family that had chosen to face the darkest parts of their story together. And in that choice, they became unshakable. The meeting that once felt like an impossible dream, or even a nightmare, unfolded with a quiet intensity that no one in the room could have truly prepared for. 4 young adults, raised by love, shaped by sacrifice, and strengthened by years of unwavering family unity, sat face to face with two strangers who, by sheer biology, helped create them. Matthew and Lila Johnson entered the private restaurant room cautiously, their faces reflecting a mix of disbelief and awe as they gazed upon the four reflections of a past they never knew existed. Their eyes, wide with wonder, seemed to scan for pieces of themselves in the faces of Alan, Zara, Isaiah, and Diane. The resemblance was undeniable. From Zara's cheekbones to Isaiah's contemplative gaze, traces of the Johnsons were etched in the children's features like a forgotten story written into their very skin. And yet, this was not a story of replacement. It was a delicate weaving of threads that had always existed but had never been stitched together. As introductions gave way to honest conversation, the awkwardness melted into curiosity. Matthew, a scientist by trade, found a kindred spirit in Isaiah. Their shared love of data, questions, and the need to understand the world through patterns gave birth to an instant bond. Lila, an artist and teacher, watched with quiet pride as Zara revealed some of her illustrations, works full of color, emotion, and identity. Alan, once so resistant to this meeting, found himself loosening in posture as he heard Matthew speak of his own track days and competitive drive. And Diane, with her heart always open, asked questions no one else dared to, about family traditions, personality quirks, and even medical histories. For the first time, the quadruplets began to see that their story didn't begin in abandonment, but in complexity. Monica and Derek, sitting nearby, felt the tremors of a truth they had both anticipated and feared. Their children were not slipping away. Instead, they were expanding. This wasn't the end of a family. It was the stretching of its borders to include the unlikeliest of members. It became clear to everyone in that room that biology alone doesn't define parenthood. Love does. Years of scraped knees, sleepless nights, birthday cakes, and unconditional support don't vanish because a donor is revealed. And yet, knowing where one comes from, the texture of that truth, can offer something profound. For the quadruplets, it wasn't a question of choosing between one set of parents or another. It was about understanding how every branch of their story, no matter how twisted or painful, helped shape who they were. But just as this sense of peace began to settle over the room, Marta, frailer than the last time any of them had seen her, quietly cleared her throat and revealed a truth that would shift the emotional current once again. Diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer, she had little time left. Her presence, so recently contested, now carried urgency. Her reason for orchestrating the meeting, she said through tears, wasn't to disrupt, but to offer what might be her final act of love, to give her children closure, connection, and choice. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't claim the right to be called mother. She only asked to be heard and perhaps remembered not just for the day she walked away, but for the days she tried to make things right. The news cast a quiet shadow over the gathering, sobering every soul in the room. Diane, with her innate compassion, was the first to break the silence, whispering a simple, "I'm so sorry," that carried more weight than 1,000 apologies. Even Alan, hardened by years of pain and anger, found his voice gentler, less guarded. They had come to this meeting carrying the weight of abandonment, but now stood at the intersection of empathy and understanding. Marta, too, had lived with a kind of death for 18 years, the death of possibility, of motherhood, of redemption. Her cancer, in a strange and cruel way, had given her clarity. She wasn't there to rewrite history, only to ensure her children had access to the pages they'd been missing. As the lunch drew to a close, the Johnsons made a quiet offer. They didn't want to intrude or replace, but if the quadruplets were willing, they would love to get to know them in whatever way they felt comfortable. To everyone's surprise, it was Alan who responded first. His voice was measured, but sincere. "I'm going to Howard this fall," he said. "Maybe we can start with coffee." It was a single sentence, but it broke open the dam. Smiles returned, shoulders dropped. And in that moment, something sacred happened. Not just a reunion, not even a reconciliation, but a recognition. These weren't enemies or threats or ghosts from the past. They were people. People with flaws, regrets, love, and stories that needed to be shared. Outside the restaurant, as they all prepared to part ways, Monica and Derek took Marta aside. She had one final thing to say, something about Chris, her ex-husband, and what he did after abandoning the children. Her revelation would soon shake the family again, but that was for another day. For now, as they embraced their children tightly and looked around at the web of people who had somehow become family, Monica whispered to Derek, all of this, it started with heartbreak, but maybe it ends in healing. And Derek, ever the quiet observer, replied, it's not the ending yet. It's the chapter we didn't know we needed. Together they walked to the car, knowing the hardest conversations were still ahead, but also knowing their family had grown stronger, not smaller, because of the truth. For 18 years they had known her as the kind, dependable aunt who always brought the best desserts to Sunday dinners and never missed a school play or birthday. But now, sitting in her warm living room, surrounded by memories and laughter, the Quadruplets realized that Aunt Patricia Moore was far more than the loving presence they'd grown up with. She was the quiet architect of their entire family. When Monica and Derek finally shared the truth about Patricia's intervention, the reason they had stayed together, the reason they had ever become a family, it was as if the air shifted. The revelation that Chris Bennett, their biological father, had tried to have them separated, and that Patricia had defied that cruelty by calling her sister and insisting they adopt all 4 children, struck like a bolt of lightning. The idea of being torn from each other was unthinkable. For siblings whose bond was as deep as blood, who had never spent more than a few days apart, the possibility that their lives might have unfolded in separate, unfamiliar homes was horrifying. And yet, it had nearly happened, until one woman with the heart of a healer and the courage of a mother said no. Patricia had known the risks. She knew the legal complexities and the emotional chaos that would ensue. But she had also seen something that others had missed. 4 tiny lives connected not just by biology, but by something sacred. Something that transcended skin color or genetics or legal documents. She had watched the hospital social worker preparing paperwork that would have scattered the babies across the state, perhaps never to meet again. And in that moment, she had made a decision that would ripple across lifetimes. She had called Monica, knowing the couple had faced countless rejections due to what adoption agencies had labeled demographic mismatch. Patricia knew her sister's heart, her unwavering desire to love, nurture, and protect. And she believed that Monica and Derek were the only ones who could give the Quadruplets the home they deserved. It was not a favor, it was a moral imperative. When the siblings gathered at her home and wrapped her in a spontaneous, tearful hug, Patricia had smiled, confused by the emotion in the air. But as Diane softly said, "We know what you did. The dam broke." Patricia listened quietly, her eyes welling with tears as they recounted what they had learned, that she had stepped in when no one else would, that she had saved them from a fate of separation and loneliness. For a moment, she seemed almost embarrassed by their gratitude. "I didn't do it for thanks," she said, her voice steady but full of love. "I did it because it was right, because I saw you. I saw what you could be, together." And in that moment, the meaning of family deepened once more. To the Quadruplets, her actions were not just heroic, they were foundational. Every late-night secret in the treehouse, every fight and reconciliation, every family road trip and holiday meal had been possible because Patricia believed in the power of togetherness. Her silence over the years hadn't been secrecy, it had been humility. She had never wanted recognition. She wanted them to grow up feeling chosen, not saved. And in many ways, that's exactly how they felt. Chosen, cherished, protected. The realization brought with it a new wave of emotion, gratitude mixed with sorrow, joy tinged with what-ifs. What if Patricia hadn't stepped in? What if Monica and Derek had said no? What if they had grown up strangers to each other, living parallel lives unaware of the bond they were meant to share? These questions haunted them, not to stir pain, but to illuminate the fragile beauty of what had been preserved. It made every memory sharper, every laugh richer, every photograph more precious, because now they knew the cost of what they might have lost. As they sat together in that living room, the past and the present collapsed into a single, luminous truth. Their family had been built not just through love, but through bravery, quiet, unassuming, steadfast bravery. It wasn't the kind of heroism that demanded applause. It was the kind that simply did what needed to be done and then faded into the background so the light could shine on those it had protected. That was Aunt Patricia. And now, as adults, They could finally see the full weight of what she had carried. For Monica and Derek, the revelation was bittersweet. They had always known that Patricia had helped pave the way, but even they hadn't understood the magnitude of her role. To learn that Chris had tried to scatter the children as an act of revenge, to punish Marta for her hesitation, to make sure she could never reunite with the babies, was almost too much to bear. But it also deepened their admiration for Patricia. She had not just preserved 4 lives, she had defied an act of cruelty and rewritten a future out of sheer conviction. The siblings decided then and there that they would find a way to honor her, not with gifts or grand gestures, but with something more enduring. Zara, the artist, began sketching a portrait, 4 newborns swaddled together in a single crib, a pair of protective hands hovering above. Diane started a scrapbook of memories and letters, each page a tribute to Patricia's impact. Isaiah began writing the story down in his journal, imagining one day sharing it with his own children. And Alan, usually stoic, surprised everyone by proposing a tree in the backyard be named after her, Patricia's oak, a symbol of strength, roots, and the shelter of love. In the end, what Aunt Patricia had given them wasn't just a second chance. It was a compass, a reminder that the choices we make, even the quiet ones, can shape generations. Her courage had changed their destiny. Her belief in love, not just in theory but in action, had become the soil in which their entire lives had taken root. And that, they realized, was the greatest kind of legacy. The transition to adulthood is supposed to be marked by freedom, excitement, and the open road of possibility. But for the Quadruplets, their 18th birthday came with emotional weight that no celebration could entirely lift. With the right to access their biological records came a flood of revelations, the kind that could either fracture a family or deepen its roots. After years of silence, secrets, and quiet sacrifices, Marta Bennett, the woman who had given birth to them, was suddenly no longer a shadow in the past, but a presence at their doorstep. Her meeting with Monica and Derek was supposed to be a small step, a cautious re-entry, but when Alan discovered the meeting had been arranged without his knowledge, the delicate balance of the entire family shifted. His decision to confront Marta alone was driven by anger, betrayal, and a need for closure. But what he found instead was not the monster he had imagined, but a flawed woman broken by guilt, shaped by fear, and desperate for redemption. Her words didn't erase the pain, but they pierced through his defenses in a way he hadn't expected. The truth about Chris's manipulation, the hidden lawsuit, and her years of silent grief did not excuse what she'd done, but it made her more human in Alan's eyes. And that changed everything. What made this moment so profoundly American was not just the emotional reckoning, but the cultural complexity it represented. In a country still struggling with issues of race, identity, and belonging, this was a story that touched on all of them. 4 Black children rejected at birth for not matching a white couple's expectations, raised by a loving Black family who had to fight a system that often failed people like them. Now, these young adults were confronting the reality of having not one, but 2 sets of biological parents. Marta, the mother who walked away, and the Johnsons, a couple who had unknowingly provided the genetic material, but had never been given the chance to love or raise them. When the Quadruplets finally met the Johnsons in a quiet restaurant, the moment was surreal. Faces that mirrored their own sat across the table, offering gentle smiles, stories, and a cautious hope. Lila Johnson's quiet wonder at seeing the high cheekbones she'd inherited reflected in Zara, and Matthew's recognition of his athleticism in Alan. It was all overwhelming, but it was Diane who anchored the moment, asking the question that cut through the noise. We're not looking for new parents. We already have them. For Monica and Derek, sitting at that table, hearing those words was everything. Their children, because that's what they were, no matter the genetics, chose them again and again through every challenge and revelation. Monica had always feared this moment, terrified that biology would override years of scraped knees, late-night feedings, parent-teacher conferences, and bedtime stories. But in that moment, she realized something simple yet profound. Love doesn't get replaced, it expands. Watching her children navigate these new relationships with courage and curiosity made her proud in a way that words couldn't capture. Even Alan, who had once sworn off any connection to Marta or their biological past, had changed. The confrontation that could have ended in fury instead ended in something softer, understanding, if not forgiveness. He still didn't have all the answers, but he was willing to listen. And when he told the Johnsons that maybe, once he started at Howard University, they could grab coffee and talk, it wasn't just a gesture. It was a bridge between past and future. But just as the family began to settle into this new dynamic, Marta dropped a final revelation that would again alter the course of their journey. She was dying. Stage 4 ovarian cancer, 6 months to a year, maybe less. Her time was limited, and she didn't want to leave without making things right. Her decision to leave her business and renovated home to the Quadruplets wasn't about money, it was about meaning. It was a final act of love, of surrender, of acknowledgement. She had failed them once, profoundly, and she knew she couldn't erase that. But she could give them something tangible, a space of their own, a place to land, to grow, to begin the next chapter. It was Alan, surprisingly, who accepted the gift first, not out of obligation, but because he understood that sometimes redemption doesn't come wrapped in perfection. Sometimes it shows up late, ragged, and riddled with regret, but it's still real. As they stood around Marta's grave 6 months later, the autumn wind tugging gently at their coats, there was no speech, no dramatic release, just a quiet understanding that something sacred had occurred. Marta had not raised them, but in the end, she had given them something just as valuable, the truth. And with that truth came healing, not just for her, but for the children she had once left behind. Diane's words lingered in the air. She gave us life twice, once when we were born, and again when she brought us together with the Johnsons. That sentence carried the weight of 18 years of silence, confusion, and emotional longing. Marta had not been the mother they needed, but in her final days, she had become a part of the family they had built. Her love was flawed, but it was real. And in a world that often measures value by perfection, this family had learned to measure it by effort, by honesty, and by the willingness to grow. Back at the apartment building Marta had left them, the Quadruplets and their parents gathered for a quiet dinner with the Johnsons. The walls echoed with laughter, shared stories, and the kind of warmth that only comes from surviving something hard together. The once fractured pieces of a complicated past had slowly, painstakingly, formed a mosaic of belonging. Not one defined by biology or legal documents, but by love, choice, and resilience. Monica raised her glass that evening and said, "To family, in all its complex, beautiful forms." The clinking of glasses was not just a toast, but a declaration. This was their family. Not perfect, not traditional, but real. And that, in the end, is what mattered most. In the quiet hush of a snowy evening, as 4 young adults gathered around their childhood oak tree, the weight of 18 years settled into something new, an understanding not just of who they were, but of who they had become. The journey that had begun with confusion and abandonment now stood transformed by layers of love, pain, forgiveness, and unexpected grace. As Marta's casket was lowered into the earth, it marked not just an ending, but a turning point. The woman who had once turned her back on them had in the end turned her life around to reconnect, to explain, to offer what little redemption she could. And for the Quadruplets, Alan, Zara, Isaiah, and Diane, that gesture mattered. It didn't erase the ache of the past, but it softened the jagged edges. It allowed them to see her not just as the woman who had left, but as someone who had tried, however late, to return. Back at the apartment complex Marta had gifted them, now their home and sanctuary in the city, the family gathered again. Not just the adoptive parents who had raised them, but the Johnsons as well, the biological parents who had never known they had children until nearly 2 decades had passed. A table once divided by genetics and circumstance had become a place of shared meals and shared memories. It was a reminder that family is not a single thread, but a woven tapestry of DNA, yes, but also of choice, time, sacrifice, and above all, love. What once seemed impossible, 2 mothers, 2 fathers, countless regrets, had become something strangely whole. Monica and Derek, the parents who had stayed, were never replaced. They were honored, their role unquestioned. But the Johnsons were no longer strangers either. They were mentors, friends, and a part of the story now. A part of the roots that helped explain where the Quadruplets had come from, even if it was the Norris family that had shown them where they could go. And perhaps that was the most beautiful part of it all, that from such a brutal beginning, racial rejection, legal battles, abandonment, and grief, had bloomed a kind of blended hope. Diane had said it best as they left the cemetery. She gave us life twice. First, by bringing them into the world, and then again, when she chose to reconnect them to a hidden history. A history that included not just Marta, but the Johnsons, Aunt Patricia, and everyone who had fought, quietly or loudly, to keep the family together. And that act of finally choosing truth over shame, healing over silence, had changed everything. Not because it solved the pain, but because it dignified it. It acknowledged the reality, honored the struggle, and allowed each member of this now expanded family to walk forward in light, no longer held hostage by the shadows. In the months that followed Marta's passing, the four siblings stepped into adulthood with a deeper sense of identity than most people ever find. College life opened new doors, but their bond remained unshaken. They FaceTimed daily, visited each other on holidays, and always returned to that little Chicago apartment that had become their symbol of continuity. Zara's artwork flourished, especially after exhibiting her series Origins, which depicted their journey from confusion to connection in vibrant colors. Isaiah pursued medical research, often in contact with Dr. Matthew Johnson, who had become more than just a biological father. He had become a professional mentor. Alan, balancing college athletics and identity, found strength in mentoring younger students, reminding them that leadership isn't about perfection, it's about showing up. And Diane, ever the anchor, studied psychology with the dream of helping children navigate foster care, hoping to become the kind of social worker she and her siblings had once been lucky enough to meet. But the emotional climax wasn't in the reunions or the funeral. It came later, quietly, as the four siblings stood once again in their backyard under that oak tree that had grown with them. There they planted a plaque. It read, "To the ones who chose us and to the ones who found us, we are all of this, and we are more." It wasn't just a memorial. It was a declaration that they were no longer defined by the choices of others, but empowered by the love that had saved them, by the courage that had emerged within them, and by the unity they had never let go of. The final toast that night came from Monica, who stood surrounded by the people she once feared losing. With tears in her eyes and Derek's hand in hers, she said, "Family isn't just something you're born into. It's something you fight for, something you build, something you forgive." And tonight, looking at all of you, I know that no matter how the story began, it ended in love. And they all raised their glasses to family in all its complex, messy, beautiful forms. Life doesn't always begin the way we expect, but healing begins when we choose love over fear. This story reminds us that family isn't defined by biology, but by the people who show up, fight for us, and stay through the hardest moments. It teaches us that even when the past is painful, abandonment, rejection, mistakes, we are not bound by it. We can break cycles of hurt through truth, compassion, and second chances. The quadruplets in this story were born into controversy, but they grew up wrapped in unconditional love, shaped by the strength of chosen parents, and ultimately expanded their understanding of identity by embracing the complexity of their origins. In life, we all face unexpected turns, broken relationships, hard truths, and moments of regret. But it's what we do next that defines us. Do we run or do we reach out? Do we shut down or do we open the door to healing? If there's one thing to take from this story, it's this. Love is not weakened by truth. It's strengthened by it. And even the most painful beginnings can lead to the most beautiful outcomes if we choose forgiveness, connection, and courage.